Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education, and it invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs, from preschool through higher education, and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with Anita Yudkin-Suliveres, professor in the Department of Educational Foundations, Faculty of Education, and coordinator of the UNESCO Chair in Education for Peace at the University of Puerto Rico. In this episode, Anita discusses the origins of her interest in human rights and peace education, how the history and contemporary social experiences in Puerto Rico shape her work, the role which her own education and her work with children in El Salvador has played in her development as a scholar and teacher, and the goals and activities of her work as a professor and coordinator of the UNESCO Chair in Education for Peace at the University of Puerto Rico. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome Anita Yudkin-Suliveres to our conversation today. How are you today, Anita?
I'm doing fine. Glad to be here.
Anita is at the University of Puerto Rico, and she's agreed to join us to talk about a whole bunch of different topics. So, Anita, how did you first become interested in human rights issues and subsequently peace education and human rights education?
Well, it's a long story, but with very clear strings attached to it. I started thinking about the issue of human rights, working with children in schools during the Civil War in El Salvador. And I started my work on human rights education because through children's rights, that was the beginning. I was living in El Salvador at the time and doing my dissertation on the schooling experience of displaced children in El Salvador. And I started reading international reports about human rights of children, children in war, children under political violence. So I started moving in that direction, trying to understand that as a field to the background to the work I was doing in schools. And then after that, that was in the late 1980s. Then in the 1990s, 93, I came back to Puerto Rico and I started teaching at the University of Puerto Rico. And some very dear colleagues of mine, Nelly Zambrana and Anaida Pascual, had just started a project on children's rights with Amnesty International in Puerto Rico. It's called Teaching for Freedom Project. And they invited me to join the project. They said, the work you've been doing and what you've been writing about regarding children's rights and political violence or context of war has a lot to do with the project that we're getting started for teachers. And so I joined them and we spent about a decade working on that project. That was a project on human rights education for children and teachers, children, youth, and teachers. And we did a children's youth festival once a year, which was a pretty big event. And the University of Puerto Rico, the Faculty of Education co-sponsored the events we were working at in the Teaching for Freedom project. And then we started doing maybe once a semester, a whole day of workshops for teachers on human rights education. And so we worked on that for about 10 years and learned a lot about, almost everything I know I learned through that project at the beginning, both theoretically and practically, about human rights education We did everything, as I said, from festivals to formal teacher training, and used all the tools we knew at that time that were appropriate for teaching human rights and promoting human rights with children, youth, and teachers. And, to this day, it's been an important learning experience for all of us who were part of that project. And then after that, there was an overlap there for a few years. The University of Puerto Rico entered the UniTwin program at UNESCO, which is the program that hosts the UNESCO chairs. And we officially appear as number one, the first UNESCO chair in the United States, because at that time, as of until very recently, well, it's been two different times in which the US in recent years has left UNESCO. And this was a time in 1996 when the US was out of UNESCO. And then the Director General of UNESCO, Federico Mayor, who had contact with professors and deans and so on at the University of Puerto Rico, invited directly the University of Puerto Rico to become a part of this initiative, which he had begun at UNESCO, and work specifically on a chair that had to do with peace education. And so when that invitation was made directly to the university through a colleague, his name's Pinchi Mendez, he was Dean of Social Sciences, and he had worked at UNESCO many years ago. They invited a group of people at the University of Puerto Rico of professors who could be a part of this chair or come up with the project that would become the chair. And my colleague Anita, who I just mentioned, who had started the Teaching for Freedom Project for Amnesty, was the first chair of the UNESCO chair. She and this group of professors, I wasn't a part of that original group. I came into the UNESCO chair about 3 years later after it had started. So they began the UNESCO chair on peace education, which always had human rights at its center, and it still does. And then while the Amnesty Project was phasing out, we were already starting to work on this project for UNESCO. And I've been there for over 25 years, working on topics of peace education, teacher training, human rights education, and also topics of sustainability. But we have other people that are really good at that, who work at the chair, because that's not my field of expertise. But we've been putting together the work on both three main topics of the work that we do at the university. So that's how I came to this, from children's rights to human rights education for children and teachers, and then peace education with a focus on human rights through the UNESCO chair. And it's been a fun ride. I've really learned a lot during these years. My colleague and friend, Anita, is the only one amongst all of us who officially had a degree that had to do with this. No, she has a PhD in education and curriculum, but her dissertation is on peace education and the creation of peace education curricula. So the rest of us joined in and have learned along the way what this field is about, both reading, formally learning about it, and actually doing it for the past decades, always with other people, both at the Amnesty Project and at the university. We've always been over 20 people at the UNESCO chair that have shared what we do there, and wonderful, wonderful students that I hate to see them go when they graduate. It's like, no, we have to find somebody else that's as good as you. That's going to be very hard, but that's how it's worked throughout the years. It's a wonderful group of people. Yeah,
it's an interesting journey and one that seems to be very focused on collaboration. Would that be fair to say?
Oh, yeah. both within, for example, the UNESCO Chair, and it was also within the project in Amnesty, and from those projects with other groups in Puerto Rico, both at the university, but mainly NGOs and civil society organizations that have worked on these topics. And, we sort of see the same group of people, unfortunately, not unfortunately, fortunately, younger people recently who have been joining the different groups that work with issues that we go hand in hand. Not all the groups are in academia. Very few, actually, those we collaborate with, and many are outside of academia, like the Colegio de Abogados.
I'd be interested in knowing about how you see your place in the larger debate, which talks about Puerto Rico's status, particularly the issue of decolonization, because in reading your own works and your own curriculum vitae, it's clear to me that you see direct connections between things like critical theory, peace education, human rights, and that broader issue of decolonization. Can you discuss that?
Well, this is a very important but complex issue. As I mentioned previously, the UNESCO Chair is officially a chair of the United States, housed at the University of Puerto Rico, because the United States is the member of the United Nations and therefore of UNESCO when it's in the organization, like it is now going to happen again. President Biden has announced that the U.S. is going to rejoin UNESCO and reopen its UNESCO office. That alone, tells you a lot about where we stand. Puerto Rico is not a member of the United Nations. Puerto Rico is not a member of UNESCO. As a UNESCO chair, understand that one main right of all peoples is the right to self-determination, which we haven't achieved in Puerto Rico. And we are in a colonial relationship with the United States that has very important restrictions in terms of political, economic, and social development that have brought us to a place right now which is not good in the sense of where we're at economically, socially, and politically as a nation. Given those very severe limitations, we're also aware that culture has been the greatest space of resistance to this lack of political, economic, and social power to make decisions about what is best for us as a people. Having said that, we, as a peace education chair, work on issues of education, very conscious of this colonial relationship. And what is the space that, given this relationship, education can have in overcoming its limitations and also recognizing certain policies that we have to work with that are there, that belong to federal U.S. government policies that have to do with education in Puerto Rico, and local policies that have to do with education in Puerto Rico. So it's complicated in the sense that we recognize the problems, the limitations, the violations of human rights it entails, that we are in this subordinate political relationship, but at the same time that we will not allow this subordinate political relation not allow us to understand that there are other ways of being, and there are other ways of growing through education, both in terms of overcoming problems of violence and in terms of learning in general about who you are and where you come from and where you want to go. So I don't know if that answers your question or makes it blurry. So let me know if you want me to address something in particular. I want to say something else about it, but I want to stop here and see if you wanted to ask me something or you want me to clarify something of what I said so far.
No, I think you've made it very clear that the broader context of being in a colonial relationship with a foreign power places some boundaries on what is possible. But you were also then going to go on about something else. I'd like to hear it.
Okay, well, I just wanted to give an example of a policy determined by the United States Congress that at the present time is like the most obvious manifestation of the colonial relationship and its impact, especially on education, which is the US Congress appointed Fiscal Oversight and Management Board. This was initiated, I don't have the exact date in mind, but it was under President Obama. I think it was 2017 or 16, that because of our colonial relationship with the United States, Puerto Rico cannot declare bankruptcy as any country would or as any state actually has. So we could not say we're bankrupt and, this is the measures we're going to take regarding that economic reality at the present time. So since we couldn't do that, the United States Congress appointed Fiscal Oversight and Management Board. I have to read the name of it in English because I can't think of it clearly. But we call it La Junta de Supervisión Fiscal in Spanish. And the board is controlled by 7 people appointed by the United States Congress. None of them are elected by the people of Puerto Rico. And of course, we don't elect the members of Congress that have voting rights either, right? We only have a resident commissioner who has a voice at the Capitol, but cannot vote on anything. So the U.S. Congress appoints 7 people who know a lot about public debt and who has to pay who in the world of the business world and big banks. And they determine all public policy in Puerto Rico at the present time because they determine where and how the budget, the local government and federal government budget can be used. So one of the main decisions of the junta, and has been an open attack to education, has been the reduction of over 50% of the University of Puerto Rico's budget, for example. And University of Puerto Rico is public university with 11 different campuses of various sizes, 3 main campuses, and we were at Rio Piedras, which is the biggest campus of the university system. In the past 5 years, we've had a budget cut of over 50% of the university's resources, while at the same time, we've had an increased impoverishment of the population because of COVID. Prior to that, a natural disaster like Hurricane Maria, because of the economic policies in Puerto Rico. So they have increased the cost of studying at the university for students and have decreased the university budget by over 50%. And I bring it as an example because sometimes people don't realize how dramatic the decisions that take place in the United States have an effect on everyday life and human rights in Puerto Rico, like the right to education, like the right to housing. I think there's a general idea that Puerto Rico receives federal funds, for example, for housing, education, and health. But those federal funds are only part of the story. No, and the other part of the story is who determines how and what and where they can be used and in relation to the population's needs. And the oversight board is a dramatic imposition of the way things are managed in the island by people who, at the present time, I think the 7 members, none of them are from Puerto Rico. At the beginning, there were 2 members that were originally from Puerto Rico. Right now, but they're not elected officials. They were bankers, So that's what I wanted to add, because I think the U.S. Congress, and this started in a Democrat administration, and it has continued under both Trump and Biden. And I think there had been some ideas in trying to limit the power of the oversight board, but nobody's talking about getting rid of it. And the worst part of it is we're paying millions of dollars. A country that's bankrupt but cannot declare bankruptcy is paying millions of dollars to pay the salaries of those 7 members of the oversight board and their lawyers in order to, I guess, make sure we don't spend more money than we have and begin to pay our debts. But that means, for example, the closing of over half of our public schools in the past 5 years. So it's not just the university whose budget has been cut. We have the most dramatic cut of all government instances, but we have also had the closing of over half of our public schools. There's a demographic issue related to that because we're losing population. We have a decreased population, especially young people who have kids. So there is a decrease in population. And sometimes that's used to justify the closing of the schools, but it's a vicious circle. You close schools, you close health centers, people start to migrate to the United States where they can get a school for their kids. And you start losing the younger population who's working and who have children. And then you have fewer schools that are not really being taken care of at all. And it's been a dramatic 6 years, 5 years in terms of what it means for daily life and for education on the island. I assume most people are aware, but maybe not. We have lost a lot of population to migration and also a decrease of birth rates, but there's now many more Puerto Ricans in the United States than there are on the island. And that's an interesting relationship because they're a very important force in the United States for us who are still in Puerto Rico. But those of us, notice how I say those who are still, it's almost like, oh, you're still in Puerto Rico. Like, oh, that's very odd because there's many people that have chosen to leave, mainly not just because of jobs, mainly because of lack of adequate healthcare and education, which is like the 2 main important things, that you need to deal with as human rights.
So how does your work in your classes and in the Peace Education Chair interface with dealing with these very pressing problems right now? What do you do in the classroom to address those things with your students?
Well, there's one thing I want to say that cuts across all those areas that we work with: peace education, human rights education, critical pedagogy, work with teachers. And it has to do with the underlying and absolute value of human dignity. If you don't have in mind, which is obviously a concept very central to human rights, well, if you don't have in mind that that's underlying everything you do, then you lose your path, you lose your guidance of what you are trying to achieve. So having that in mind, that is why we believe that human rights is essential to all the work that we can do to address different issues of violence, different issues that have to do with colonialism and other major global problems, like global warming and natural disasters and so on. If human dignity is at the center of what you do, then you start thinking about, okay, how you incorporate human rights into all these issues, and how do you deal with issues in what in Spanish has been called local. It means global and local. How do you tie in the understanding of local issues with global issues, or with issues related to what's going on here, what's going on in the United States, and what's going on internationally? And what having that in mind, you need to be able to make those connections in class, whether I'm teaching the peace education class or whether I'm teaching my regular education courses, which are in the area of psychology. We work on, I teach a class on human development. Well, how do you relate all these issues with how you understand that a child grows up in the middle of all of this to become a better person, for example? And in the peace education class and in the work of the UNESCO Chair, that we've been playing, I guess, is I can't think of a better word. We've been playing with two things that might seem opposing. One is, but they're not, they're interrelated. One is, how do you land things to our reality? Now, how do you understand what peace is in the Puerto Rico context? How do you work towards justice and human rights and equity given our reality? So we've called that Puerto Ricanizar la paz. Okay, how do you bring peace to the Puerto Rico reality? But at the same time, how do we understand international issues, especially problems like migration, global violence, global warming? How do we understand the relationship between these major issues with our reality, and at the same time, how those major issues impact everyday life in Puerto Rico, for example? So it's been Puerto Ricanizar and internacionalizar, how you have a broad focus to understand what you're looking at in relation to major issues worldwide, like, for example, those that I mentioned, and others. And in my peace, I'm very fortunate in my peace education class because it's an elective, and most students that take it from different fields at the university are hungry to find ways to tie all these things together. So it's a very interesting work, how we can help each other understand complex issues and at the same time be able to propose things we would do from our different areas, professional fields. The university has also started 4 or 5 years ago a minor on human rights for students. It's an interdisciplinary minor for students from any faculty. It's housed at the Faculty of General Studies. And then the peace education course is just one course they can opt to take within that minor. And I think it's becoming very interesting for students to pursue that minor. And also we're having wonderful students putting together their knowledge, their fields of interest, their professional development, and their undergraduate students in relation to human rights. Because I think there's very little perception or understanding that human rights are not only for lawyers to talk about, and although the undergraduate students are in the minors, some of them want to go to law school, great, but most of them come from social sciences. They're in psychology and sociology and social work. There are a lot of them that come from the humanities. I've had quite a few from natural sciences. So that minor and the course that I teach in the minor allows very much for that interdisciplinary way of understanding complex issues. And
would it be fair to say that these students come to you with either a very basic or total lack of knowledge about human rights?
Okay, before the minor existed, go back 5 years, their knowledge was like zero. They'll not zero because they'll say, "Oh no, well I know, Puerto Rico has a constitution and the United States has a constitution, and some rights are explained there." But that's pretty much as far as they would go. But now that they have the minor, they really come to the class because this is not the first class they've taken the minor. So at least they're familiar with many issues that have to do with human rights. But last semester, I had 17 students in class, and 10 of them were in the minor, but the other 7 were not. So it was a very interesting combination from those who at least had an idea, questions about human rights, and those who come to class and say, "Oh my, this has to do with human rights," or, talking about peace education is not just about inner peace, or it's not just about finding a quiet a space to be at peace. Peace has to do with fundamentally human rights, and it has to do with building justice and equity and so on. That is also new for them when they come to the peace education class, even for the ones that come from the minor on human rights.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. Our next episode concludes our conversation with Anita Yudkin-Suliveres, a leading scholar in the fields of human rights education and peace education. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HREUSA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Player FM, Pocket Cast, and Deezer. It will soon be available on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy@hreusa.org. That's KRISTI@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes host and producer Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Terbruggen, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu-Gota. The Human Rights Education Now logo was designed by Kim Berering. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.